we have certain potential or potentia that for some reason or another, they lie dormant within us. And becoming who you are is going through the often painful and uncomfortable, but always rewarding in the end process of creating spaces in which those things can come out.
Hi, I'm Patrick Parker, and you're listening to the Becoming Who You Truly Are podcast, a show that helps us all live more authentic lives. This week, I am absolutely thrilled to be speaking with Gary Lachman, who was a founding member of a pop group you just may have heard of called Blondie. Gary's songwriting took Blondie to the top of the charts and to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but Gary has also created an amazing body of work as an author. He has written a rock and roll memoir of the 1970s, as well as many biographies of philosophers and mystics. In this episode, Gary gets real about how comic books, his time with Blondie, and encountering the works of Jung and other mystics shaped his life story. And I'm sure that by the end of this hour, we're all going to be inspired by Gary's story, which will prove that if we follow our interests and take risks, that we can all create meaningful lives. Hi, Gary. How are you?
Hi, Patrick. I'm well. It's a fine Friday evening here in London. So it's Good Friday, the Easter weekend. Actually, it's rather quiet. I noticed it a bit because a lot of people are trying to get away.
I first found your work in a library here in Oslo, I guess last summer or 2 summers ago. I came across a book you'd written entitled Jung the Mystic. And as many people who watch the podcast know, the title of the podcast and of my book came from a quote by Carl Jung, that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. So I thought that maybe we could just start our time together by talking a little bit about that book and what inspired you.
This was a book that was commissioned by a fellow named Mitch Horowitz, who's at the time was an editor at Tarcher Penguin. That's now Penguin Random House. And this was quite some time ago. And I'd written a book about Rudolf Steiner for him. And he asked me if I had any ideas. And I thought, well, I'd like to write something about Jung. And originally it was supposed to be sort of an introduction to kind of a, not necessarily Jung for dummies, but some more like an intro. But then when I finished it and sent that in, Mitch asked me to expand it a bit because he thought it was, it could have been a standalone. And I've always been interested in Jung. Jung is one of the earliest I guess gateways, as we talk about these sorts of things these days, into all the sorts of things that I've been writing about now for quite some time. When I was my early teens, and I came across a reference to Jung from reading Hermann Hesse, and I was one of the many hundreds of thousands or millions of sort of Hesse readers in the well, for me it was the early 1970s. The Hesse phenomena started in the sort of mid 60s, but by the time I found out about him, I guess about 1970, someone gave me a copy of Siddhartha, and there was all that. That was the beginning of sort of how I became interested in this sort of thing. So in any case, I was familiar with Jung in the sense of reading him from early on. Can't say I understood him when I read him when I was 14, but that was probably the first time I read him. So it was somebody what I like about doing these sorts of books is I have an opportunity to say, okay, this is what I got from Jung, or this is what I got from Steiner, or this is what I got from Madame Blavatsky or Crowley or Gurdjieff or whoever, and this is my take on them, and it's personal, but it's also I'm doing my best to lay out their ideas for the reader, and I'm discovering it in the process just as much as I'm transmitting it to the reader. So it is like that for me. So it's a learning experience for me. So in any case, Mitch asked me I said I'd like to write a book about Jung. So I wrote this shorter book, and then he asked me to, it's not a long book as it is, but he asked me to expand it a bit. But Jung was someone who I said was very important for me early on. I read Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. It was in the high school library, the high school I went to in New Jersey. I don't know who else read it. They may have been. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't generalize like that. But the whole idea of the notion. Well, as your your program here, or your podcast here, is dedicated to this notion of becoming who you are, which is an idea that, I mean, Jung talks about it. Nietzsche had as well, and it goes back to Pindar, poet, ancient poet, classic poet, and Hegel. I mean, this is the whole notion of and like coming upon that as I did in my early teens, and also at that time in America, because it was still the sort of the hippie days, sort of the '60s. I mean, I picked up on sort of the tail end of that, but I mean, all that notion had discovering who you are, and um, dare I say, doing your own thing, and all that. Those kind of cliches. They had currency at the time, and so it was very powerful for me then, and it infected me with that idea. So I was glad to have an opportunity, to come to terms with Jung in the book, and it's a short book. While I was writing it, I was on holiday in the Italian-speaking area of Switzerland, Ticino, if you're Italian, or Tessin, I think if you're Deutsch, and Ascona was what used to be this was a resort town, a century or so, a bit more ago, but now it's very, very upmarket. But along the Lago Maggiore, there was Casa Gabriella, where the Eranos gatherings took place that Jung presided over in the sort of 40s and 50s, and I was invited to there wasn't anything going on, but I was invited there. Someone I knew was there, and I was invited and shown around. So it was I got some kind of bit of field work, as it were, in what somewhere where Jung had been, and all of that. So yeah, I'm glad I had an opportunity to write the book.
When I read the book, the impression that I got was that it was the most easy to read, accessible biography of a philosopher or a psychologist that I had ever read. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And I also enjoyed the aspect of looking at Jung from a little bit of a different lens of this, from a more mystical or spiritual side. And the thing that I took away the most from the book was this idea that I think you talked about Jung I and Jung II. You talked about how Jung had to figure out a way to balance the spiritual world that he was very privy to, that maybe the vast majority of people aren't. But then he also had to figure out how to be a person in reality and make a living and carry his message to other people in a way that didn't sound crazy to them. So that was the most interesting part of for me in your book. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, originally, there would have been a question mark. It would have been Jung the Mystic, but the editor thought that would have put people off. So, he added this subtitle to the esoteric dimensions and something like that. I mean, it does touch on that, but no, the whole idea, or the thing with Jung was that, he was a cagey character. He played his occult cards, as we might say, very close to his chest. And he did have, I was going to say, he did have these two lives. Even as a child, there's the famous story that when he was young, when Jung was young, he had these fantasies that he, in a past life, or he was also this 18th century gentleman, who wore a tri-corner hat and rode in a very magnificent carriage and had buckles on his shoes and things of that sort. And meanwhile, he's he's growing up with his neurotic father and his equally, even more so, neurotic mother, and all this tensions going on. And Carl was growing up in a very strange environment and all that. So he had these fantasies, but then in his life, he was very much deeply involved with the occult and the paranormal and the mystical and all of that. And all this came out late in life, and that's sort of almost, very close to the end of his life. And in fact, his fame and kind of, how should we say it, kind of authority as a spiritual kind of figure, really bloomed after his death very much, when the Jungian kind of world sort of exploded. But even during his lifetime, in his last years, and he was talking openly about synchronicity and writing books about flying saucers and the I Ching and things of that sort. But this was all stuff that he was fascinated with very, very early on. But he kept it to himself, prudently, in different ways. He, as you said, he not only made a living, but he made major contributions to psychoanalysis. He was obviously, that's, Freud and then Jung, and the whole great sort of Greek tragic drama about, Jung was supposed to inherit, and then he, rejected it, and then he's thrown out, and then this is, fantastic drama there going on. And yeah, but that was the whole idea. Is like, well, because Jung, even himself, there's this famous. I begin the book more or less with this quotation from him from this interview late in life. Is 57, I think, with Richard Evans, if I'm not mistaken. I'm trying to remember right now, top of my head, but it was filmed. It's on YouTube. You can find it. But he's asked, are you a mystic or something like that? And he said, whoever thinks I'm a mystic is an idiot or something like that. But then, because he's a scientist, Herr Dr. Professor, I'm Herr Dr. Professor Jung, I've got certificates and this and that kind of thing. And so make no mistake about that. But meanwhile, let me check the I Ching, but I alone with my, a select group, and we will talk about our visions we've had recently and all that. And I'm talking about this kind of, off the cuff here, but that's more or less what, what it was like. So that was sort of the tension of the book. It's like, well, what's that about? But I think as I say in the book, relatively late in life for him, in his late 60s, in the last days of World War II, he slipped and broke his leg, and then while he was in the hospital, he had a sort of cardiac arrest, and he had a near-death experience and all that. And he seemed to come out of that a bit chastened, in the sense of not being so worried about his career standing and all, and by that time Freud was dead, anyway, and there was nobody else really, not too many anybody else was around, and so he kind of came out of the closet, as it were. But that was the tension about there. I mean, that's one of the things I try to do in the book, is like, okay, there's a question here. Like with Rudolf Steiner, it was sort of like, okay, I mean, Steiner, the question for him was like, how could someone who wrote a very cogent criticism of Kant and Kant's, epistemology, and then on the next page, he's talking about the Buddha on Mars, or what it was like in Atlantis. It's sort of like, okay, there's a bit of dissonance there between those two kinds of things. How could that, be the case? So that was the tension there. So this, with Jung the Mystic, it was like, well, what's going on here, Carl? With the Carl who is very much, he grew up. His mother was in seances, his cousin, and he was involved in them. And he wrote his his first thesis and all that kind of thing. So what's all that? And then you kind of, how should you say, you sort of detach yourself from it, even though you were involved in it all the time. And so that was the question.
That's very interesting that you brought up Steiner and Freud and other people that had these dissonances. And well, when you were giving all those examples just there at the end when you were speaking, it made me think of, well, Hegel. You mentioned Hegel earlier, and Hegel talking about, I think he called it dialectics, when you're kind of doing two things that are contrary at the same time. So maybe the great thinkers are able to do that better than the rest of us mere mortals.
Yeah. But that's very much what Jung's about. The transcendent function is that psychologically, where you come up against basically a rock and a hard place, and the tension between those two things psychologically produce what or trigger, and I don't mean that in the bad sense of that word these days, the transcendent function, where with any luck in your dreams, some symbol is produced in the dream that can reconcile these seemingly irreconcilable opposites in that. So that's, and William Blake, we recognize that as well. Without contraries, there's no progress. Opposition is true friendship. So there's this a kind of base understanding of this sort of polarity and the tension between polar opposites, which are not, it's not the same as binary dualities, or it's not so much contradiction as polar tension and necessity and all of that. So I mean, Jung is in a camp that sees that as kind of essential.
Gary, that's all really interesting. And you were talking earlier about how you found Jung when you were in high school. I don't think that's within the normal bell curve of high school literature for most people, but that's really fascinating. And we were also talking a little bit about Jung's childhood. So I was wondering if maybe we could take a step back for a minute and go back to, like, who were you when you were a kid? Where were you from? Like, tell us about the generation that you grew up in. Give us a little bit of the backstory. And then maybe as we go through your life, we can also interweave some of these philosophical ideas and these incredible books that you've written.
Right. Well, I was born in New Jersey, a place called Bayonne, New Jersey, which may as well have been another borough of New York, because it was just across the Hudson from Manhattan. And certainly one of the most important events in my life I can remember is learning how to read through comic books. Probably I became aware of myself at the same time that I became aware of comic books in some way, and that must have been. I'm pretty sure I was reading at the age of 5, and may have been an early 5, because well, this is a defining moment for me is and about all this is a sense I remember I was with my grandmother, whatever, and I remember asking her for a dime, 10 cents, to get a comic book, because comic books were 10 cents up until, well, this is the story. I found this out. This was a blow against me. As the world suddenly became abrasive, and at the it must have been November, I would say, of 1961, and I would have still been 5. I was born 1955, but at the tail end of Christmas Eve baby. So I was born at the end of 55, so more or less beginning of 56. So in any case, so in November of 61, I would have still been, 5 years old. And I must have been reading before then, because I had already had a few comics. And I remember asking my grandmother for a dime so I can go buy a comic. And she was a tough old, Irish battle axe, and she really didn't want to give it to me, but she gave it to me anyway. And I went to the shop and I picked up, there was a copy of The Flash. She was one of my favorites. And I gave the guy the dime, and he said, "Sorry, they've gone up to 12 cents. And this was, oh Lord. And so I had to go, okay, can you hold me back? And I had to go get another 2 cents from my grandmother, who didn't really want to cough it up, but she did eventually give it to me. I must have thrown a fit or something. And I remember her saying to me, "Don't get one you got already." So that suggests I already had some. So I had been reading already. So that, that was, and another, early moment, and this again is related to comic books. There was a strip, or it was one of the backstories in adventure comic books. There was it didn't have its own comic, at least then, but it was like one of the, you had the Superboy, I think, was the main character in the adventure comics, and there was a couple other, shorter features in the back, and one of them was something called the Legion of Superheroes. And these were all teenage superheroes from other planets or from the future, or things like that. And this predated the X-Men, who were Marvel did 1963. The X-Men, they were these strange these teenagers with strange powers, which were much like the early Beats or the hippies. They were the strange teenagers with strange powers who were threatening the adults. So there's that kind of meme, as we would say, was going around. But in any case, one of the characters was named Cosmic Boy. and he had magnetic powers. I didn't understand why wasn't he called Magnetic Boy. So I didn't know what cosmic meant, and I remember asking my sister, and she didn't know. And I asked my mother, and she didn't know, and I didn't bother asking my father because I figured he wouldn't know either. So I must have, I could say I've been trying to figure out what that means ever since. So that probably predated, you know, or around the same time as having discovered, the world suddenly becoming very challenging when it was like no longer 10 cents but 12 cents for a comic book. So I mean, these are early moments, and I know I'm no way unique in this whatsoever. I mean, I was one of many millions of kids at that time in the early 60s, who were dedicated comic book uh, you know um, addicts. I mean, I certainly that was certainly the most important, and until and then later discovered science fiction, and fantasy, and sword and sorcery. I was a big sword and sorcery fan. Conan the Barbarian, and Edgar Rice Burroughs, and the Mars books, and all that sort of fantastic escapist fiction. That was and that I later tie that in philosophically to the this notion of this other world. Is the everyday world of getting and spending, unavoidable, implacable life, as the poet Baudelaire called it. But then there's this other world, or other way to live in the world, which is more meaningful and adventurous and exciting and all that. And I even write about this in an article. And it was a talk I gave. There was one character in particular that DC had. He wasn't a superhero because he didn't have superpowers, but he was called Adam Strange. And he was an archaeologist who, just by chance, was hit by this strange beam of light coming from another planet called the Zeta beam, and it took him to another planet called Ran, RANN, and where he becomes a hero. It was sort of the Edgar Rice Burroughs, scenario where John Carter gets sent up to Mars, and becomes sort of this warrior hero there, and wins the princess and all this sort of thing. So the same sort of thing happened with Adam Strange, but the effect of the Zeta beam wears off, and he's sent back to Earth. And he spends the rest of the series of him trying to he's somehow figured out the mathematics of when this beam is going to hit again, and where it is on the planet. And so it's kind of like Indiana Jones sort of archaeologist sort of thing, where he goes to different Mayan temples, or the Himalayas, or some weird place, and then he's but that seemed to me, Jung might call it an archetype, but a metaphor of this sort of the otherness, the other way of being in the world, the other way of perceiving the world that the romantic vision is about. And many have wrecked themselves in the attempt to stay on Ran, to stay on the other planet, but it is a noble endeavor, because it well, it leads us to, I would say, the frontiers of our our own being and our own existence, which is I would say, in one sense, and I'm in some way I'm interested in that sort of journey, that kind of pursuit.
That's really interesting that you said some people wreck themselves trying to stay on Ren, and so I'm very much probably more on the side of the people who want to stay on Ren, and my better half is an engineer who was firmly planted on Earth. And over the last 5 years, we've sort of met in the middle. So we're not on Earth, we're not on Ren. We're somewhere halfway in between, floating in space together, and it's quite nice. But it's in my first career, I was a classical musician, and I very much lived in the world of the musicians who lived around the same time as some of these philosophers that you write about. Bach and Mendelssohn and other, of those figures. I got to live in Germany for a while where they lived. And so I tried to live on planet Ran, and it wrecked me a little bit. I had to sort of draw back for 5 years. And now I'm sort of getting back in that world a little bit. But yes, we can definitely wreck ourselves to try to stay on Ran too long.
Well, I mean, again, it's I guess that's the metaphor, but again, in the comic book, he does, and there's even, as you say it, there's it's just by chance I remember coming across when I was giving a talk on this for some conference a few years ago, and I was searching, the internet for images from this comic, and there's even one where there is a scenario where he's trying to stay on Ran, and there's some evil doer who some way doesn't want him to. But I mean, but I would say all the spiritual traditions are about that to some extent. That's the transformative journey in some way. This comes out of one of the people who've been a big influence on me. The British writer Colin Wilson, and one of his earliest book, his first book was called The Outsider, and it's just written in the mid 1950s. It's existentialist, analysis of the meaninglessness of contemporary life and so on. But it's about these figures who have a deep hunger for some kind of meaning and purpose in a world which seems bereft of that. And there are different ways in which they deal with trying to fulfill this appetite or this need, and some of them do wind up wrecking themselves. Others find a way, and I guess I'm optimistic in thinking that there is a way, and but yeah, there's no guarantee.
Well, that's really interesting that you were able to weave what you learned about comic books as a young child into your later career writing about philosophy. That's really, I think, very creative to synthesize those two things. Also, well, I have to ask you about another big part of your life, which was being in the pop music world as a member, or rock music world as a member of Blondie. And I guess maybe that also contributed to your work now as a writer. Also, maybe you were able to synthesize some things you learned from that time in your life also. And I know that some of the books you've written have been about sort of the marriage of philosophy and pop culture or rock music. So tell us a little bit about that time in your life. It's really fascinating to me, at least.
Well, I mean, I first became interested in all the sorts of things I have written about now for many years during that time when I was first playing in Blondie. This is like before Blondie became anything. A few years before they became very famous. This would have been around this time of year, early spring in 1975, so almost 50 years ago. Yeah, I had wound up playing with them because I was living in New York at the time, and I was never really a musician. I had delusions of being a poet, and I was writing a lot of very, very bad poetry. I wasn't going out of my way to make it bad. It just it just was.
I can relate to that.
Well, there you go. Someone I knew from New Jersey. I mean, I was living in New York at the time in the East Village, and someone I knew from New Jersey went to playing drums with again. This is before Blondie. They were nobody at the time, and then they lost their bass player, and I could kind of, sort of, almost maybe play, but that was what was needed at the time, and so I wound up going and jamming with them, and I wound up playing with them, and this would have been, yes, at night, this time, early April 1975, and so I was in Blondie up until sort of the late summer of '77. And in the early days, the CBGB days, but we all lived together in Chris Stein, Debbie Harry, and myself. We lived in this loft space on the Bowery. It was very, as you imagine, it was like bohemian, squalor at its most glamorous. And I had no interest in anything about the occult aside from weird fiction like H.P. Lovecraft. And I was a big Weird Tales, fan of all that sort of thing, or horror movies from the '40s, like the Frankenstein series or the Dracula, the Wolfman sort of thing. There's Universal horror films. But no, I was never really interested. I read a lot. I was reading Hesse, and I was reading Sartre and existentialism, Nietzsche, and all this kind of stuff. But I wasn't really interested in the occult. But a book I came across at the time really knocked me out. And it was by this British writer I mentioned already named Colin Wilson. And he wrote a book called The Occult that came out in the early 70s. I came across it in 75. And what was fascinating about it is that he approached the occult with all from a philosophical perspective. So it wasn't just a book of spells or ghost stories or stuff like that. I didn't know. I mean, I only later I discovered about him that he, wrote books about existentialism and phenomenology and things like that. And I didn't even know I knew what existentialism was, but I didn't know what phenomenology was at this time. And but I was fascinated, and it was a page turner. I mean, you said before it was easy to read my book. Well, and any capacity I have for writing like that comes from reading and rereading his books, obsessively over the years. And he has this wonderful fluid style, where at the same time he's dealing with these very, very exciting, vital, deep, profound questions about, freedom and purpose and consciousness and all of this sort of stuff, and hidden powers. And there I am, all of 19, thinking, yeah, I'm all into that kind of thing. And so that was another transformative moment. I mean, in terms of what I'm doing now, was coming across that book. I mean, that book literally changed my life. I would not be who I am now, here sitting in London talking to you, had I not come across that book. Most likely. And this was at a time when I was playing and writing music. I wasn't writing anything. The music just came out. I mean, the songs just started to come out of me at the time. So there was the girl groups, then the British Invasion, the Beatles, and then all the other Brit groups, the Zombies, and the Animals, and the Herman's Hermits, and the Kinks, and all these, and then Motown. And then there was sort of the San Francisco sound. And so it was all these, great, and this was AM radio. So it was all these great 2-minute, songs. And I grew up listening to that on AM radio. And I wasn't a musician, but that came out when I became a musician for a while. And so I wound up, playing bass in Blondie, but I played guitar, and I wrote a couple songs. And one song, Ex Offender, was the first that was their break. That was the song where they got their first record deal, and that later the 45, and then that later led to the first Blondie album. But more to the point of what I'm doing now is a song that I wrote called "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear," and this was about telepathic and sort of shared dream experiences I was having with my girlfriend at the time. And when I was on the first Blondie tour, and things like we would try to call each other at the same time. And again, this was much before mobile phones or any cell phones or anything like that. So, you had a phone booth, you're in a hotel room or something like that. And then it turned out we had same sorts of dreams. And so I wrote the song about that. So it became a big hit in the UK. It's like, I think one of the only songs in the top 10 has the word theosophy in its title, in its lyrics.
You said you didn't write the songs, they just came out, and you weren't really a musician, you just played. Can you explain to someone who maybe is more in the world of reality what you mean by that? Are you able to put words to that? Because I know what you mean by that, but many people would think, what in the world is he talking about?
Well, I mean, what I mean by saying I wasn't a musician was that when I was growing up and I was a teenager in Jersey, I had friends who were all great musicians. I mean, the drummer in Blondie, he was from Jersey. I used to see him play in bands. So that's how I got into Blondie. Because I knew him, Clem Burke. I knew him from Bayonne. He played in bands in Bayonne, and used to go see him play, and hang out with him, and all these other people. And they were all like really, really good musicians. I mean, in the sense where like they would like figure out a Jimi Hendrix lick or an Eric Clapton lick or something like that. And I but hanging out, I picked up a few chords and all that, but I wasn't really, part of these people, wasn't really part of that crew. I picked up a lot from listening, as I said, to music when I was a kid, and then I listened to music a lot. And then, when the thing in New York was happening, it was all very simple. It was like it was simple, stripped down, 2 or 3 chords kind of thing, and I could play that sort of stuff. And I was in the right time at the right place, and when I was also like on the edge. I was like part of a small group who were into, at the time nobody else were into, people like David Bowie and the New York Dolls and Mott the Hoople, and this was, you know, glam rock and glitter, and I was wearing makeup and all this kind of stuff, and everybody else was like into the Grateful Dead, or, you know, and you know, it's fine, but you know, we were these small band that were on the edge of this kind of thing that later became quite popular. Yeah, so when Clem started playing in New York and they lost their bass player, he said, "Why don't you just come and jam?" And I had already gone to some of their shows and helped, you know, bring in the equipment and that kind of thing. And so I wound up, you know, it was fine. So the rudimentary way in which I could play was enough at the time. And then I basically learned, you know, more as I went along. And then what I meant was that, I mean, I could do what I do even now. It's like, you know, I could play my own songs really well, but I'm not like a great session musician, put it that way, you know. But I could play my own things, and what it is I got something out of the guitar. So I learned enough chords, and I guess I had absorbed sort of melodies and chord structures and progressions from hearing all this music, that I started to write songs. And then they came out, and they were, you know, they were in that sort of style. They were sort of in this kind of 60s pop sort of style. So I mean, that's what I mean. It was more, I mean, that's what was happening at the time too. It wasn't, you know, I mean, you're a musician in the sense that, yeah, you could bang out a few chords, but you weren't, you know, these great, fantastic, you know, muso. I mean, one of the things I would say in interviews was that, like, by the early 70s, you had to go to the Juilliard School of Music in order to play rock and roll, you know, like bands like Yes, and well, these are the prog rock bands, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, these big Wagnerian, you know, epics and that kind of thing. And incidentally, and, you know, something that I've noticed, but I haven't seen this come up too much in the context talking about this, you know, but even in the early 70s, there was a nostalgia for the roots of rock and roll. It was a group called Sha Na Na that did all the old doo-wop numbers. Then people like Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard and others had comeback careers in the early 70s. So, which was interesting because it was only about 15 years of nostalgia, you know, for the roots of rock and roll. It was like an early nostalgia. So that was sort of in the air, and that's what was. I mean, UK punk was much more aggressively, you know, screw all that old stuff. I mean, but the New York stuff actually was more. Well, they did homages to that period. So, but yeah, that was the context in which, you know. So I mean, I wrote lots of songs, you know, and I a couple songs of Blondie, and you know, one was a big hit. And I had my own band, and I wrote quite a lot of songs, and I sang and I played guitar and all that. So I could do that, but it was like, okay, this was a means for me to get expression. And then at a certain point, I think I had exhausted what I could do with that. And as I say in this book, I wrote about this period, this memoir called New York Rocker, My Life in the Blank Generation. I just got too smart because I was reading too many books. So I got too smart for rock and roll. I couldn't, you know, and I started listening to classical music, Mahler and Bruckner on a Walkman. I was like one of the first people in New York to have a Walkman. And my girlfriend was at the time was a model, and she brought one back from a shoot in Tokyo. And this was, I mean, literally, I'm walking around and I had the headphones on. Nobody else has these things, and they're, ooh, what's that? But I'm listening to Bruckner or Mahler or Sibelius, and this was like, this is, this was like the bells are ringing for the end of my pop career, because after listening to that, I just couldn't, I couldn't play it anymore.
Well, Bruckner, you're speaking my language. I heard of my first Bruckner symphony when I think I was 20 years old. I heard the Cleveland Orchestra, the first live Bruckner symphony with the Cleveland Orchestra when I was 20. And I'm getting goosebumps just remembering. So he's a very special composer. Yeah. And the thing I love about him most is he never really found what we consider his voice until he was in his 40s. So anytime I feel like I need to rush myself, I just remember, okay, Bruckner didn't do anything meaningful until he was 40. So I'm fine.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I used to collect I called them late bloomers, ones who, different artists and writers who, it wasn't until, because I felt that was myself, even though I had a career as a musician and a singer and a songwriter in my 20s. Well, that was this whole, I mean, that was one of the things that happened. I mean, I left, I was living in Los Angeles, and I left Los Angeles and I came here to London. This was beginning of 1996, and I had just turned 40. And it was do or die, become a writer, or fail. So that's so I don't know. I guess 26 books later, I don't know. I guess I've become a writer. So that's what I tell the IRS when I have to do the taxes. So
Well, let's go back to you leaving Blondie for just a moment. I mean, I just think about so many pop groups or classical, whatever, anyone in the arts. It seems like they just ride that train until, I mean, like Queen is still performing, with a different frontman, 40, 50 years later. So I think you leaving was a bit rare. And I imagine I would make up that must have been hard for you to sort of leave the certainty of that and say, I'm going to go do something else. Can you take us through that whole process and how you found writing?
well, the first thing I did was I had my own band. That was when I left Blondie. I wanted to have my own band, so I did for a couple of years, called The Know, K-N-O-W, and that came from my interest in Gnosticism, Gnosis, and things of that sort. And we didn't get a deal. We put out I put out a couple 45s, and we were a good bi-coastal band. We had followings on L.A. and New York, and we didn't get a deal. And then the last music I did at that time was I played guitar with Iggy Pop on 2 North American tours. But at that point, that would have been 1981. So the end of 81, beginning of 82 is when I stopped. I retired officially. And I would have been about 26 then. Well, I had become fascinated with the occult and the paranormal and mysticism and esotericism and consciousness and all that fun stuff. After reading this book, The Occult by Colin Wilson, and then I just started devouring all that sort of stuff. I got really involved with Crowley for a while. It was because that was the other early influence when I was living in this loft space on the Bowery with Chris and Debbie. There was this wild artist, flamboyant gay biker artist who had an unfortunate fascination with the Hells Angels, living in the place. It was actually his place, and he rented us the floor we had. But he was into Crowley, and he had Crowley's Thoth Tarot deck, and he used to do these impromptu readings, and he painted these canvases based on those things, and got me interested in Crowley. And one of the books I came across first was Diary of a Drug Fiend. And, we were all interested in drugs at the time. So that, that made it popular in the first place. And then I just became more and more interested in it. And at a certain point when I lived in LA later, it would have been the later 70s, I got involved for a while with the Crowley group. And I was performing rituals and ex-body and all this kind of stuff. But after, not too long, I found it a bit claustrophobic. It was all roads lead to Crowley. He's a massive egotist and all that sort of thing, and absolutely oblivious to other people and so on and so on. So I just kind of, outgrew that. And then,
Isn't it funny how that works? That so often in spiritual groups, he ends up feeling not so spiritual in the end.
Well, it all depends. I mean, Crowley has a particular philosophy. I wrote later, many years later, I wrote a book about Crowley, and he talked about the crossover with sort of the pop culture world and the esoteric world. So that book dealt with that. So, Aleister Crowley, magic, rock and roll, and the wickedest man in the world. And in the 60s, I mean, my first book, Turn Off Your Mind, was about the 1960s, and it's kind of a revisionist history of it, but no, it's critical, and it challenges some of the 60s, shibboleths, and but that was a decade when the occult and mystical and the magical was sort of the most popular thing around, all over pop music and films and television and comic books and so on, and literature, blah blah blah. So but he was one of the figures that came out of that time. He was basically rediscovered in the mid '60s by the the counterculture. And but he remained kind of a rock and roll. Oh, I hate to use the word icon. Remained a rock and roll figure, exemplar, uh, uh, up until more recent times, with rap or whatever. I don't know what the most recent thing is. I'm so out of it. I'm so out of it. I'm probably into it and I don't even know. But whatever. He continued to maintain this kind of figure as this wild tearaway, dangerous to know character. All the rap bling guys liked him because Crowley was into bling. He had all these magic rings and stuff like that. But I was involved in the Gurdjieff work for a while, which is a very, very different story. Very, very austere, serious, rigorous regime of psychological and physical exercises and things of that sort. But this is quite some time ago. So after, this is a while ago. So I haven't been involved with any particular teaching. I've tried to understand as many of them as that have come within my purview with my interests and things of that sort. So, this was the early interest in this kind of stuff. And then, but it took a very long time. I stopped playing music in '82. I didn't start publishing any articles until about 10 years later. And whereas the songs used to just come out in the sense that I would strum on the guitar and hit a couple chords and a melody would come to me and I'd find another chord. And then if a song didn't come in like 10 minutes, it wasn't a song, it was a fragment. So that was my soul, the lyric soul, speaking. But then later when I wanted to actually, try to talk about ideas, communicate ideas, that took work. So I actually had to learn how to write. And why I wanted to do, I don't know why. I asked myself, why did I think this was so important? But it must have something to do with communication. It must have something to do with sense of self, in some way, because you do, even if you're writing something objective, it's you doing it in some way. So I know myself. I have very strong sense of self when I'm writing. So that must have been part of the attraction. But it took me a long time. It took me a good 10 years to learn how to do it, and still working on it. But I've been doing it, professionally now, I guess, for about 28 years or something like that. So
that's very interesting that you said songwriting was. It sounds almost like it was Jung's concept of synchronicity, like it just flew through you in 10 minutes or less. But writing is much more difficult. It sounds like that's very interesting.
I never tried to write a song, and I don't know how quite to say it. Some kind of melody would come to me, and then I would pick up a guitar, and then I would hit a couple chords, and then I found it. And that over a period of about, I don't know, let's say 5-6 years, that happened. And I wrote. Two or three songs I wrote for Blondie are ones people know, but there were others. Here we go, sad story. When I had my own band, lots of songs, but they're not known because they weren't recorded by Blondie or a major and recording artist. But their songs, they're good songs. So it's for a good period of time. I must have wrote about 20 songs or something like that. So we used to do them with my band, The No, and all that, and I sang them, and so they're very much the lyric soul. The lyric poet, romantic poetry. It's about you. It's about your soul. It's about the poet's response to things of that sort. So that's what that was. And then from my reading, I somehow thought, well, actually, I want to deal with these ideas, about consciousness and existentialism and meaning and purpose and all this sort of deep, profound sort of thing. And it was a very different, kettle of fish, as they say, or used to, than being inspired, as it were, and and a 2.5 minute song coming out. So it was a different sort of thing that I actually had to learn over the years how to do it. So yeah, it's a different process. It's a different sort of process.
You said even when you're writing about someone else, for example, the Jung the Mystic book, that it still is coming from you and that you have a strong sense of self when you're writing. I can definitely vouch for that in your book, Jung the Mystic. I felt um, it was not a dry read. It was very interesting, and I felt like I knew you, even though I didn't know you. I felt like okay, there's a friendly person writing this book. So
Well,
yeah,
well, thank you. That is a very wonderful compliment, because that's sort of, one wants to feel like, okay, you're just in conversation and talking, with the person. And I think it is possible to write about, important or deep or whatever you want to call it, ideas, and not in this academic, either dry or often very big kind of way. Um, and um, and it is I said, it's my take on these people, and it's my encounter with them. So it's my encounter with Steiner or Crowley or Gurdjieff or Swedenborg or Jung, and others, and that's as it should be, because that's how they would want, I would think, want to encounter them in a way that it affects you personally, not in a dry academic way, but in some kind of existential way in which you're changed, with the encounter with these people. When you say you feel like you know me, I always feel like I know them, and this is the way they'd want to be known, I mean, when you meet these people in real life, they often are very disappointing, uh, you know, in different ways, but if because you meet the best of them already in their work.
yes, I maybe I know you mean in that I've watched a few interviews with Jung, and he wasn't who I thought he was in my mind, who I'd made him out to be when I read his works. He talked differently. He carried himself differently. So yeah, maybe we make them in our image, but it's as you said, I think that's definitely at least what Jung would have wanted. I think.
Well, I think with Jung, I mean, when he's unbuttoned, he's very approachable and he's very funny at times. But he's often, I'm here, Doctor Professor now, and I have to, put these things in this certain way. And I think that that informs a lot of his writing. But you can get the unbuttoned Jung in the introductions he does. Like or the commentaries on like the I Ching or Zen Buddhism or something like that.
So, Gary, it's been really fascinating talking to you over the last hour or so. I've learned so much. And um, in this first season of the podcast, I've been asking every guest the same set of questions. So, if it's okay with you, now I will proceed with you as well.
Okay.
The first question that I've been asking each guest is, in the vein of this quote by Jung that inspired the podcast, becoming, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. What do you think it means for a person to become who they truly are, to be their most authentic self? What does that mean to you if you had to define it?
Well, interestingly enough, I've been writing about that in context of my own life, and that's well, I guess it is the sense of we have certain potential or potentia that needs to be unpacked, needs to be opened up, and I would say that's the actual what Maslow calls self-actualization. So you have certain capabilities, and Jung would say the same thing. He might not say capabilities, but he might say certain ways of being or certain possibilities of personality and all that for some reason or another they lie dormant within us, and becoming who you are is going through the often painful and uncomfortable, but always rewarding in the end process of creating spaces in which those things can come out. You mentioned earlier somehow, well, people who are, rock musicians, that's what they do, and they do that as long as they can, and all that sort of thing. And I know, people in that world that are doing that, and I didn't do that. That could mean two things. Well, I did what I could do, and that was it. I didn't have anything else to do, left to do, or I could have stayed in that world and whatever in some fashion or other. But no, I consciously moved on to something else because I felt like this new center of gravity, this new sort of impulse in me was who I truly was, and it's always a risk. There's a risk involved. There's always a risk involved in some way. I would say, and this goes back to this notion earlier about some of the people who try to live on that other world. They wind up wrecking themselves, but because there's a risk, there's no guarantees, and there's no guidebooks. I mean, I think it's like in Faust, where just somebody, he says, which way, and he says, way, what way? there is no kein Weg. There is no way. There's you have to find the way yourself, because the pursuit is of yourself. And I don't mean that in the egoistic sort of way, self-aggrandizement, but it's like the deeper kind of thing. So before I drift off into sort of generalities there, but that's what I would say. It's sort of unpacking the possibilities that you come equipped with, as it were. We can talk in computer speak. There's certain software you come equipped with, and but you don't know you have it until you try to use it and all that. And that's a passable answer to the question, I think.
Oh, that's a great answer. And yeah, and there's risk involved. That really rang true for me. Yes, very true. The second question that I've been asking people is basically, what are the things you do that help you feel most alive and authentic and connected to, well, who you truly are? So you mentioned writing. Is there anything else?
Well, listening to music. I mentioned, the classical composers. I find remarkable works of music I would never have known existed on YouTube these days, and I've never heard of this composer, don't know anything about him. Let's check it out, see what that's like. So I found some fantastic discoveries that way. Reading. I mean, the usual sorts of things. I mean, I live in the city, so nature, it's urban nature, but, I like today, I spent a good part of the early afternoon riding around on my bike through the greener areas of North London where I live. And so I enjoy doing that. So, I try to take in what you can, absorb, and yeah, I mean, stay open. That's, again, this vague generalities, but that's sort of the thing. You never know. You never know. That's one of the things I try to keep reminding myself, is that you don't cash in your chips in the sense of like, okay, I've got this all figured out already. No, you never know. You never know, and something just might happen around the corner or wherever. That's yeah, life is full of surprises.
Yes, correct. And yeah, the other question that I've been asking people is, at this point in your life, do you feel settled and like you're, who you're meant to be and like comfortable, or is there work you're still doing? And if so, what is that work? Or is it both?
Well, I mean, I'm one of these people who, if I'm not working, I don't know what to do with myself, and that's I think I'm going to have a horrible retirement whenever I'm forced to do that. But yeah, I've just done a series of little projects for a company that put out these maps. And there's one I did about Aleister Crowley. It's like the Beast in Britain. So it's all the different places Crowley went to in Britain, and little stories or little entries about each of those ones. I did one about the horror writer H.P. Lovecraft, and where he lived in Providence, Rhode Island, and then in New York, and then people don't know about him is that he did these incredible journeys up and down the eastern seaboard of America during the 1920s and 30s, just on coaches and all this sort of thing. And the most recent one I did is the I don't know if you know the Inspector Maigret stories, the Georges Simenon. Well, he's this famous detective, fictional detective, Inspector Maigret, and most of his stories take place in Paris. So I did a map about different locations where different murders took place, and that kind of thing. So I mean, that's just fun. I enjoy doing things like that for fun. But I like to keep busy, so I'm in between books at the moment. So I'm in a tense pre next thing phase. where some I'll be trying to come up with something else to pitch to one of my publishers.
For me, that's the funnest part, is when I'm finished with one thing and it's getting to start something, the next creative project. That's the most fun part in the creative cycle for me. The worst part for me is the last 5% of any project I'm doing. It's like pulling teeth. Yeah. And so my last question for you is, do you have any hacks or tips for the audience? Things that they might be able to do or read or listen to that can help them on their own path to becoming more authentic and more of who they truly are?
Oh God. Well, follow your interests. I would that's very broad, but I would say that's one of the truest ways to finding about who you are. What are you interested in? Find out what you're interested in. In fact, this can be an interesting or a difficult question. I mean, I mentioned Abraham Maslow earlier. He's the American psychologist, and he's known as the father of humanist psychology. And he had this notion of self-actualizing, sort of bringing forth this potential within you. But he said one of the things that we think we know, we actually don't really know, is what do you really like? What are you really interested in? What really draws you? What draws your attention? And I think, and follow that. I mean, that's the way. If the goal is to yourself, the way is any direction. The way lies open in any direction that you can follow. But try to follow or keep in touch with what makes you feel alive, what excites you in some way, what entices you, what do you want to find out about. I mean, there's certain things this is an interesting question, because I've always I think it's an interesting philosophical question. What actually is interest? Where does interest comes from? You certainly, and there's ways something might not strike you as interesting, and then another time you see it in a different perspective. Suddenly it's like, oh my God, that's interesting. Somehow you see a connection to stuff like that. So again, that's very vague in general, but I think that is something that we take for granted, thinking that we know what we really like and what we really are interested in and what really attracts us. And you might, I think it would help anyone to sort of get a clear idea of that. And it's a kind of radar. It's you can pick up the signals of that sort of thing.
That's such an interesting and insightful answer. I was just, when you're talking about, do we really know what we're interested in? Or maybe we're not interested and then we come back to it later and we are, so my better half, I would have never done a YouTube channel if not for my better half thinking, oh, I really want to do it, but I'm afraid of being in front of the camera. So Patrick, can you be in front of the camera? And I really wasn't that interested in it at all. And then I went to India and had this amazing experience. I wanted to share it. And that's sort of how this whole thing started. But I never thought I would want to have a YouTube channel or want to do a podcast. But sometimes we don't know what we're interested in. And it's become a very meaningful thing in my life. So yeah, a very, very interesting point you made. Oh, Gary, thank you so much for sharing your time with us tonight and telling us a little bit about your books and all the amazing work you're doing, and sharing about comic books and Blondie and music and Bruckner and all sorts of things. Is there any final thought that you'd like to leave us with, like any big overarching principle, or make it good? Give us a big.
I don't know. I think I've already given you a couple here. So
fair enough.
It's difficult. No, the way is difficult, but it's worth traveling. There you go. All right.
It's perfect.
What else are you going to do? What else are you going to do while you're here? You can waste time. And I always think of it as Pascal's wager. If you know Pascal's wager, it's like if God Blaise Pascal was a 17th century religious thinker, but also a logician and mathematician, and he was a young friend of Descartes, and he said, "Well, look, the win-win situation is to believe in God, but you could say believe it's worth the effort, okay? Because if making the effort it winds out to be not worth it and life's just meaningless, then okay, well, so what? So if you make the effort, life's meaningless, so what? And if you don't make it, life's meaningless, so what? But if it happens to be life is meaningful and you don't make the effort, then you do lose out. And if life is meaningful and you make the effort, well, that's the win-win. So the only possible win is to make the effort, because if it's meaningless, it doesn't matter either way, whether you do or you don't. But the only possible way that it could come out to be a win is that it's worth the effort to try to what do you want, what is it that we're trying to get to, like who you really are. The effort to get there is worth it, even though it's a painful process. So I'm being far too profound for this evening, so
No, it's perfect. I'd never heard of Pascal's wager, so
look it up. No, I think I probably muffed it a little bit, but it's along there. That's like the win-win.
I worked in a high school for a year as a counselor, and I wish I had known about that when I was with those kids, because
right.
High schoolers, they're very they're high schoolers,
Yeah,
and
sure.
yeah, I wish I had that. I could have been sassy with them.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for having me on your show, and good luck with it.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you'd like to support the channel, you can click on the Patreon link in the description box below. And while supplies last, I'll send you a free Audible version of my book, Becoming Who You Truly Are, with your subscription. Thanks for watching and listening, and until the next episode, I wish you nothing but the best on your life's journey to becoming all that you truly are.